Good evening, everybody. My name is David Plyler. I'm with the Music Division at the Library of Congress, and I'm really excited to have you here for this exciting series of events that we're going to have, and by that I mean both the events tonight and the events that continue tomorrow. It's my privilege to introduce the two members of Pixelated Audio who have an amazing podcast that you should check out. Bryan Mosley and Dreyband. They're here to give us a talk about kind of a brief history. They're going to hit every single game ever made. That's what I've
in 30 minutes.
Yeah, that's what I've been told. So that's our expectation, contractually. But no, and just kidding. But we're really pleased to have them here, and they're going to be joining us later in the event that we're having in the Coolidge. So you'll get to hear more from them at that time. So please welcome Pixelated Audio.
Thank you. All right. You good? All right, I'm Bryan, and this is Gene of Pixelated Audio.
Hello.
We are from the San Francisco Bay Area, and we're here to talk about the evolution of game audio over the last 50 years or so. Because of time, we are not going to do a comprehensive look at game audio history, but we've put together a few points to illustrate the progression of game audio, focusing more on the milestones. And really, until recently, a lot of people consider game audio, especially outside of context, nerdy or kind of strange to listen to. But over the last 25 years or so, the appreciation and support for game audio and game music have been rapidly growing, and seeing that happen in front of us is something pretty incredible. So what is Pixelated Audio? It's a video game music podcast with a historical and preservation focus. We focus on discovering and highlighting game music throughout history, past and present, and it's kind of like a platform for composers and game designers, developers to share their stories and share specific memories from development or something that happened during that specific time.
So, you're wondering why a podcast about video game music? Well, for one, games are a lot of fun, and great games with great music are even better. There's so many amazing games with great music coming out today, and a rich history of games that have already come out, and there's more coming out every day. And as Bryan mentioned, we get to be part of a large and growing community of people that love and share their love of video game music. Fun fact, Bryan and I actually met because of MagFest, which some of you might be familiar with. It's an organization that puts on video game music events throughout the entire US, and they're actually based in Baltimore. So,
yep. All right, so what makes games and their music so special? Well, games are distinct from a lot of other popular media, right? So, and that really boils down to the interactivity and the experience while you're playing the game. The interactive elements are distinct, and they're engaging. They provide some kind of experience that's hard to recreate in other forms of media. Another thing here is that many of the biggest developments in game history happened within recent history. So some of you may remember a time before games even existed, right? And some of you might remember things when, Minecraft was the new thing. So, it's a diverse crowd, and it's fairly recent history. But just like any form of media, games and their music developed due to changes in technology, but only few of those are intrinsically linked to the evolution of computers as games, which probably couldn't exist otherwise.
So we're at a point in time where games are extremely expressive. They can range from really small to these huge, expansive worlds. But like we said, it wasn't that long ago, and games were pretty basic. And to illustrate just how amazing all this progress has been within our lifetimes, we're actually going to go back to an earlier example of film, which dates back to the 1870s. So in 1878, we had the photography experiment, where Edward Muybridge was asked to see if a horse ever lifts all of its feet off the ground at the same time. He set up a line of cameras set off by tripwires, and we basically have the first ever motion photography. Oh, I think you skipped.
No, I think that's it. Can you see the GIF there? Yeah.
Okay.
Yay, it worked.
Yeah, awesome. We're not seeing the same thing over there. So that's really the beginning. In 1888, we have the Roundhay Garden scene, which is the first surviving film actually shot on camera. And that's this right here. In In 1895, Edison and William Dixon recorded their experimental sound film, which was their opportunity to try to synchronize audio with video. The synchronization wasn't that accurate, but it was a huge leap forward. Again, in 1895, we have a silent film, but this is Baby's Lunch, which was the first time the public actually got to see a film in the world. They actually paid for the privilege to see this at around $15 today.
This is my favorite slide. The $15 and it's like a minute watching a baby eat food. It's like a trailer. That's awesome. $15.
So in 1902, we have A Trip to the Moon. Some of you might recognize this scene, which is the rocket sticking out of the moon's eye. Very recently, there was a restored version of this film that looked like this, in color. But this isn't actually really a color film because they hand-painted all of the frames one by one. Beautiful, amazing, but not scalable. In 1908, we have A Visit to the Seaside, which uses alternating red and green colors to produce this color effect. Still not quite there. 1917, we're still using red and green, but film shot at the same time. We're starting to get a little bit closer. Finally, 10 years later, in 1927, we have The Jazz Singer, which is black and white, but you can see the film quality has improved quite a bit. Not only that, full movie, synchronized sound, 90 minutes long. So pretty close to what we recognize as modern film today. And then here we are in 1932, Flowers and Trees. It's a Disney animated short. It's about 8 minutes long, but we have sound, color, everything's together, finally. So if we look back at that entire time, it took us 54 years to get from motion photography to full color, sound, synchronized, everything together. So why is all that important? Why do we bring this up? Well, a lot of that early film history has been lost or taken for granted. These kinds of opportunities do not come around very often. And we're at a point in time where games are still within recent memory. And we've developed to a point where we can actually start to capture some of that history. And many of the people that were involved in this process are still alive today.
Right.
And that's why we at Pixelated Audio love what we do.
Yeah. All right, so with that, let's start with this slide. We wanted to start with a slide because we get questions and statements like this a lot, and I'm sure if you like game audio and you tell your friends, they might ask you some of these. First of all, game audio, no, it didn't start with Super Mario Brothers. Certainly a breakthrough, but that happened much later in time. It also still isn't just bleeps and bloops.
Yeah, you still have some nostalgic soundtracks today, but game music has definitely gone way, way beyond that at this point.
Yeah, and another one here is game music isn't really a music genre. Although a lot of early soundtracks were limited by sound hardware and technical limitations, the music could range so widely in style between that the only thing they had in common was that they were in games. So we'd like to kind of maybe say that it's more close to a category of music and something like film music.
And finally, game music is absolutely real music. It may have started out very, very simple, but as time has gone on, and as you'll hear later tonight, we have some really talented composers that have joined, some that write for film. It has become an art form in and of itself, and some of the best game music can stand on its own outside of the context of games.
So just like the early days of film that Gene was talking about earlier, there was a period of games where they didn't have any sound at all. We do want to bring those up just quickly.
So we go back to 1947. We have what's considered the first electronic game, the cathode ray tube amusement device. Very catchy name. It was never sold commercially, but you were able to control a laser beam on a screen. You have Tennis for Two, which was played on an oscilloscope with paddle controllers. And we move on to 1972, the Magnavox Odyssey, the first video game console, but it didn't have any sound. So all of these are huge milestones in game history, but we're here to talk about audio, and it takes a bit of a different piece of hardware in the 1970s to get there.
Yeah, so we want to kind of start in the arcades where everything started blossoming and the scene and video games were just really starting to come alive and people could get their hands on them. So starting with the early 70s.
Yeah, so the early 1970s is an interesting time for digital technology. Pocket calculators were starting to become a thing. You could buy one for the price of a used car.
Yeah.
And not a cheap one necessarily.
Yeah, so many things were happening, really close together, and it's hard to pinpoint exact dates for some of this stuff. Wasn't recorded very well, or the documentation just isn't there. So behind the scenes, we didn't really get a good look or a good recorded history of what actually happened. So based on that, most of these things that we're bringing up in milestones are generally acceptable ideas based on word of mouth or what has been documented. And the first one dates back to the arcades, being Pong.
So it turns out Atari's previous game, Computer Space, in 1971, was actually the first game with sound, but it was Pong that really changed the direction of the game industry.
Yeah, if it's not obvious, Pong, the name comes from the sound, Pong. So I mean, that they were thinking about how to kind of incorporate audio into the name and draw people into this interactive experience. The initial version actually didn't have sound, but the designer was thinking like, oh, okay, how do we go about adding some more elements to this to make it more interactive? And what he did was he got an amplified speaker, connected one of the ground wires to the board and another to another pin that gave him the best audio possible. And that was kind of the birth of audio in games, that small little innovation.
So let's listen to how that sounded.
Exciting stuff.
Very primitive, but great. So
we skip ahead to 1975. Taito releases Gunfight in the arcades. We get sound effects and a short melody from Chopin's Funeral March. This one's incredible.
So the next year, Atari comes back in 1976 in arcades with Breakout, which is basically a single-player Pong. It featured rhythmic tones, creating one of the first times game was synchronized between sound and music, so it's part of the gameplay. This game might look familiar to some people.
That could go on for like 3 more minutes. I'll spare you. All right. So 1977 was a big year for the industry. Atari released the VCS, or the Atari 2600, which sold really, really well. Unlike the Magnavox Odyssey, the 2600 was the first system to offer interchangeable game cartridges and dedicated sound hardware, which meant you could have a wider range of games, and developers could experiment with new ways of engaging the player. The 2600 wasn't that impressive with the audio and the audio department, with only one pulse channel and one noise channel, but allowed game developers to create basic sounds with their games and create music that was at least engaging enough for people to enjoy the experience. We have a clip here from Combat, which was one of the Atari 2600 release titles, and take a listen. That was a lot louder than I expected. We recorded all these videos beforehand, and we weren't sure how the audio would sound, so hopefully we didn't blow out your
Well, hey,
eardrums.
you got 2 sounds at the same time. That's pretty good.
Yeah, it was pretty awesome. And that first shot was very lucky. So the Atari 2600 uses these pitched tones for bullets and the noise for the engine rumbling around. Basic, rudimentary, but pretty cool.
All right, so in 1978, we're back in the arcades. Taito releases Space Invaders. It's pretty simple sound design and has a basic 4-note pattern for the background music. But here's where things get interesting. There was a programming bug, and as you defeated more enemies, the intensity ramps up and the music gets faster. Go ahead.
Making me more nervous.
Yeah, it's like that very panic-inducing heartbeat right there.
Yeah.
So in 1978, we already have a game with adaptive difficulty. It gets faster as you play, and interactive music, even if it was a bit of an accident.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here, a lot more going on here than just the simple tones. Because from here on out, we can start seeing how things like tempo and key changes and progressions start creating atmosphere in games and become allow the player to become a part of it. And it was a very similar concept used in Asteroids a year later. 1980 was a huge year for arcades with Namco's Pac-Man. Almost everybody knows the Pac-Man, like worka worka worka, and the iconic bullet chomping sounds. It's almost, you get this sense of satisfaction running through the maze and chomping. It's almost like you can't stop. But that's how important the audio is to the game and what makes Pac-Man the experience that it was. Rally X was completely overshadowed by Pac-Man and Defender when it came out, but it's actually the first game to have continuous background music during gameplay. We don't have a clip here, but it's something else. It's pretty impressive. 1981 was another big year for the arcades. Frogger switches out background music as you complete levels. Donkey Kong has these kind of cinematic experiences where it goes through this whole progression of, Donkey Kong swiping the princess and climbing up, and this really nice experience with different jingles. Galaga did the same kind of thing, really great jingles and startup chimes and bonus level and stuff like that, sound effects.
It really doesn't take long for the influence of games to go beyond just the arcades. Now, we go back a few years, and in 1978, we have the band YMO, or Yellow Magic Orchestra from Japan. They sampled early arcades and consoles in their song Computer Games. Now, YMO was a huge innovator in pop and electronic music in Japan, and they influenced the sound of many, many early Japanese video game composers. Go back and listen to their albums and listen to their music, and you'll hear the influence immediately. Now, on the other side, in the US, we have the song Pac-Man Fever.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, well, you listen to it now, it's not so great, but in 1981, it sold 1.2 million copies just for the single, enough that they put it on a compilation album with a bunch of other songs about arcade games. It was a cheap cash-in, but hey, you don't sell 1.2 million copies if games aren't a big deal, right?
So back on the game side, in 1981, Tosei released Vanguard in the arcades, and this is a significant one. It was one of the first games to use digital voice, to get this really like voice, but at the time it was impressive, and you can actually make out some of those sounds. It was also one of the first games to use licensed music, and so this is actually really cool. Let's take a listen to this clip.
Bon voyage. Let's attack.
So, yeah, if you recognize some of those tunes, the first one on there is Star Trek, the motion picture. It's the theme of Star Trek. And then the next one's Flash Gordon. We get the bonus. And those were both really early examples of licensed music in games. Journey Escape was released on the 2600 in 1982. And this was interesting because it was the first time a high-profile band, Journey, was squeezed into the video game space. Includes music from some of their hits, and we're going to spare you from playing a clip because it's pretty awful, and the game is really bad. But it's important to kind of note in history.
Next. We have one more stop in the early arcades here.
Yeah, so finally in the early arcades, we want to bring up Gyrus, released by Konami in 1983. By this point, arcades were huge, and companies were trying to think of ways to cash in on gamers' money, and so they were trying to think, like, what can we do? We need better graphics, better sound, better gameplay. Gyrus had all three. It was revolutionary, literally, pun intended. You're moving around in a circle. And Konami threw in 5 sound chips for this and an extra processor just to give it this really big sound. And with that, we get this dance electronic version of Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. We could kind of just keep playing that all day.
Yeah, every time I watch that clip, it's so cool. So, you're on their side. Okay, in the 70s and early 80s was a period of rapid growth in arcades and home consoles, but games have been around for about 10 years now, and people wanted more. They didn't just want bigger and better arcades, they wanted to bring that experience home. And for that, a new wave of hardware was coming that would push the boundaries of graphics and sound. Just kidding. If you had a PC in the early 80s, you got nothing, basically. It was a business machine. It had really, really primitive sound hardware. You got a single square wave channel, on, off, no volume control. That's it. You mostly heard this when you started up your computer when there were errors, which was a lot in those days. And of course, some composers were pretty clever, even with some really limited hardware restrictions. So we have an example from 1984 with the game Alley Cat.
Look at its tail. So cute. That was published by IBM too. That's crazy. Okay, so moving back a few years, in 1979, the game industry was graced with a dedicated sound chip. And this was the AY38910, the same chip used in gyrus. It was a programmable sound generator, or a PSG, and this chip and variants of it were ubiquitous to games and pretty much everything in the mid-80s. It was in the Intellivision, the Atari ST, Sega Master System, MSX, arcades, pinballs. It was just used everywhere. And one of the reasons why it was so popular, there's two main points. One is that the sound was pretty good, and the second is that it was cheap. And everybody likes cheap stuff, and especially companies that have to mass produce these things. So the chip itself had 3 square waves, and 3 different voices for square waves, and 1 noise channel. And this doesn't seem like a lot, but the chip was both flexible and versatile, which made a very strong option for developers at the time. We have 2 examples here using the same chip but on 2 different systems. The earlier example comes from Snafu on the Intellivision in 1981, which is basically like Snake.
Short loop, but it's nice.
Yeah, and so 5 years later, in 1986, we got Penguin Adventure by Konami on the MSX, and it's a much later game, but it's still using basically the same sound hardware. And one thing we love about this is just seeing how far composers go with the same chip, how much they learn, and that experience grows over time to what they can produce. Pretty much up until the 90s, all games were just adorable.
So, some of you might recognize this machine. After the PSG chip, we have the Commodore 64, which had the SID chip in it, or the sound interface device. While the PC and Macintosh were huge in the US, the Commodore 64 was the home computer in most of Europe. It's still very fondly remembered. Released in '82 and sold until '94, it was one of the best-selling computer models of all time. And the C64 introduced many young musicians and programmers to music and sound, and computing, actually. Yeah.
The SID chip, designed by Robert Yanes, is still considered one of the best sound chips of the 8-bit era. And unlike the PSG that we heard just a minute ago, this chip was a full synthesizer. It was very capable. It had programmable analog filters, multiple waveforms, more than just the square waves, and it had pulse width modulation. Long story short, this is a very capable chip, and a lot of people were able to do some really, really cool stuff with it.
So we're going to play 2 examples. First, Commando, which is a port of the earlier arcade game. It uses the theme of the original but turns it into a totally new song.
We also have a sample from Myth, and this was 1989. And by this time, composers had started to learn the sound hardware and the techniques and what you could do with it. And it doesn't stop there. It goes even to 2019. They're still playing with it. But here's an example that we want to show that uses a lot of new filtering and stuff that was learned around this time. Is it going to play? Nope.
Now, there's no way that we could talk about video game audio without bringing up the Nintendo Entertainment System.
Yeah, released in Japan in 1983 and the US in 1985, the US was inescapable in both countries. It wasn't just successful, it was a phenomenon, cultural phenomenon. And it sold 60 million units and really made the game industry pay attention.
So it had some pretty modest sound hardware, but more voices than the last one. You have 2 pulse waves, which is kind of like those square waves that you heard earlier, a little bit more capable. A triangle channel, which people typically used for bass. A noise channel, which we use for sound, like sound effects and percussion. And a sample channel, so you could record small little short samples and then play those in the game.
And if you look at all 5 of these channels, you notice one thing, it is kind of organized like a band, right? Nintendo was conscious about this decision. They're thinking like, okay, how can we add each role and make it easier for programmers and developers to get like a real band sound out of it? And that was by giving it assigned roles. And so in this next example here, we were talking earlier, game audio didn't start with Mario, but it did change the way that it did set the bar and change the way that we perceive a lot of game audio today. And a lot of things were built on the shoulders of the soundtrack. So let's start with a track from Mario. And this is Underwater theme.
You hear sort of the melodies, the sort of bass, and then the percussion there. It's all very separated.
So Koji Kondo, the composer of Mario, he had to think about so many different things to make the player really engaged and really feel like they're part of the experience as it progresses, as you progress as a player. And it paints a picture for the industry on how game audio should start curving. And it's something that's really integral to the experience, and turning it off is like turning off a sense. If you try to play Mario without the audio, I guarantee it's just not as fun, and you probably not do so well at it if you're an old school gamer like us. So this next clip here, though, we just heard a track from Mario. This next one is Journey to Silius, which came out 5 years later, and the same sound hardware, but the composer, Kodaka, he uses the sound hardware a little bit different than we just heard.
Wondering why that bass doesn't sound the same as the one in Mario. They're actually using samples instead of the triangle noise.
Kind of reassigning the band members to different roles. Have the trumpet guy play a tuba.
So game sound's been getting progressively better, right? So what is coming around the corner here? The next thing that's coming around is FM synthesis, or frequency modulation. So maybe you've never heard of FM synthesis, maybe you have. But the technology powering it owes its success a lot to this next piece of hardware, and it's not a game. The DX7 keyboard.
This is the coolest ad ever.
Yeah, we got it from Retro Synth Ads. So back in the early 80s, when this thing came out, every big artist in the 80s wanted it. It's synonymous with the 80s synth sound. Turn on the radio station to a classic station, you will hear it.
Within the first minute.
Pretty much. So Danger Zone by Kenny Loggins. What's Love Got to Do With It by Whitney Houston. Pretty much everywhere. The technology's been around since the mid-'70s, but it took a while for it to take off commercially. But one of the best things is frequency modulation can make some pretty cool sounds.
Yeah, the theory is that with the right algorithms, you can approximate any instrument. This wasn't always the case. And a lot of people tried really hard to make a certain instrument, and it ended up sounding fake. But the theory is you could just make anything you wanted.
So after the success of the DX7, Yamaha started to make lower-cost versions of these FM chips. And again, like the PSG, they put them in everything. Cheap kids' pianos. Maybe you had one. I did. Arcades, game systems like the Sega Genesis, computer sound cards. Basically,
everywhere and anywhere.
Anywhere and everywhere, yeah. So we have 2 examples here, both using the same chip, the YM2151. This first example is from Marble Madness, the first game to use FM synthesis. You hear things sound quite a bit different from some of the earlier examples.
Yeah, a lot more tinny, a little bit more brash, but this is what they got with limited experience with FM. I forgot how hard this was to play. These videos I took, and I was not doing so good.
All right, and the second example is just a few years later from Sega in 1986, Outrun. Some of you might recognize this game. It was a huge, huge game in arcades. You actually sat down at the steering wheel and got to select your music and drive through various coastal areas. Really awesome. Here's that same chip making a lot more different sounds.
Get ready. So I purposely wasn't driving here so that you could actually hear the music. It's like a nice, really smooth jazz track. It's really good. So we don't have time to have other FM examples. We really want to, but low on time. So the Sega Genesis, Japanese home computers like the PC-98, PC-88, all that stuff, we talk about so much on our podcast that if you want to learn more and if you want to hear more, we're big fans. A lot of, I see a few guys are also big fans in the, yeah, I know, big fans in FM synthesis and game audio. So you can check us out there if you want to hear a little bit more. FM is great, and it holds a special place in all of our hearts from that 90s era.
Yeah. Now, after that, we get to the era of sampling. So, if you're not familiar, a sampler is basically a device that allows you to record music from anything, a musical instrument or, speaking, whatever, and then play it back in a musical fashion. So, this opened up huge possibilities for creative uses of sound in music, and it's a hallmark of hip-hop and rap to this day. Now, dedicated samplers in the mid-'80s were really, really expensive. We're talking many thousands of dollars in, those days. So it's now like $7,000. Yeah. So as you've seen already, this existing technology was sort of miniaturized or made simple and used in game consoles and was a simpler and more cost-effective way for game composers to explore new ways of making music. Enter the Commodore Amiga in 1985, the follow-up to the C64, the Commodore 64. The Amiga was a very popular early multimedia computer and was used in media production environments for quite a few years.
Yeah, the Amiga is essentially a 4-channel sampler. It was flexible, powerful, and it was a little bit strange. You had 2 channels that were hard pan to the left and 2 that were hard pan to the right. But there was so much that composers can do, and also just independent amateur artists that wanted to experiment and play with new sound.
So the Amiga was also the birth of a new type of music composition program called a tracker. The first trackers didn't sell very well, but hackers figured out how to make low-cost clones, and this kind of thing took off.
Yeah, this image might not make a lot of sense, but programs like this were really, really popular and cost-effective solutions for amateurs that didn't have all the money to pay these high-end audio workstations, and like professional studios had. And they were ported to a variety of different systems, making music composition for games in the late 80s, early 90s a lot more easy and a lot more accessible. If you look at the image here, each of the 4 blue columns is essentially a set of instructions, and each sample channel has its own instruction for what instruments should be played and for how long. And since most of these notes are just reiterated samples, the same set over and over, the music could be compact enough to fit on a diskette and maintain a decent level of fidelity.
Yeah, so this is not really an audio recording the way you'd think of like a WAV or an MP3. It's like a digital file that basically says, play this.
Play this here.
Yeah. Now, we get to the Super Nintendo a few years later, which was another sample-based system, similar to the Amiga, but it came out a few years later, so it had better audio capabilities. By this point, sampling was pretty well understood, and Nintendo also shipped development kits with sample libraries so people could jump into composing pretty quickly. Now, the SNES had 8 sample channels compared to the Amiga's 4, but it still only had 64 kilobytes of audio RAM, meaning these samples had to be really short.
Yeah, just like the NES, the Super Nintendo sold really well, and Nintendo's technical influence can't be understated. The catalog of high-quality games with great soundtracks on both the NES and the Super NES are some of the most well-loved examples and most remembered examples from early history. So it's something that we have to really embrace and kind of preserve as we move forward in game time.
So we have 2 examples here, one from the Amiga and one from the Super Nintendo, and they're about 5 years apart, which is about the interval we've been doing. But,
right. This is Shadow of the Beast on the Amiga from '89. only about 5 or 6 instrument samples in this track. And they're just reusing them when they need to, based on the track. This next one here is from Final Fantasy III, which was released on the Super Nintendo in '94. Square was putting out gold as far as audio was concerned, and everything that they put out is really well remembered today. This one is a really great track, and I think it demonstrates some good selection of audio samples on the Super Nintendo.
You can hear the clarity is a lot crisper on this.
Still sounds very gamey because the samples have to be so short, but it's really pretty, very beautiful.
So, yeah, we did have some recording of the battle there afterwards. But by the late 80s, we have all of these different competing ways to make music. And it wasn't really that easy to make games if you had to have 3 different audio hardware configurations. So, industry was looking for ways to make reduce the cost that you had to deal with if you needed to know sampling and FM synthesis and old chips. So we start to see
this standardization of music. Yeah.
So enter sound cards and MIDI on home PCs in the late 80s and early 90s. Maybe you've heard of MIDI. For some of you, it means really cheap sounding music. But really, MIDI is actually just a set of instructions, just like those you saw on those Amiga trackers. And by the mid-90s, most PCs supported MIDI natively. Even the Sony PlayStation shipped with MIDI capabilities. And even though MIDI was standardized in '83, it continues to be used to control music interfaces and all those sorts of things today. So I took this screenshot of the same file opened up in 2 different pieces of software. One in DOS and from 1990, and the other one from an application that's from 2019. Same file. You can load it up in both places and play it back.
Yeah, you might notice the name of this file is canyon.mid. If you're a big Windows, Windows 95? That was
yeah.
It's that audio
The
file.
super nerds will know this one.
Yeah. All right, so Doom defined first-person shooters and probably the most influential game of all time. In terms of audio, we have 2 examples here to demonstrate just how different the different sound capabilities were and what they were doing and what they were starting to lean towards at the time. So this first sample here is from the FM version or the ad-lib version of Doom.
This is like older technology.
So you hear those drum hits are pretty weak sounding. It's a little bit, you can't tell if it's a guitar or a horn. And the second example is using the state-of-the-art MIDI module. This is a roll-in version, so let's take a listen to that. Real drums. It's very awesome. I remember playing this. It was incredible. So, of course, MIDI had its limitations, and there was a lot of other ways that game developers were wanting to introduce new ways to get better audio and better quality in their games.
So hopefully everybody here knows what a CD is. Otherwise we're going to feel really old.
Really old.
So most of us have probably ditched our collections, but CD technology was a huge revelation for games at the time. So as we mentioned, we talked about it, early games had to be very small. They had to fit on a floppy disk or a cartridge, maybe a few megabytes at most. Now, consoles started adding CD-ROM drives, which gave you all this extra data that you could play with. You had a lot more space. So you weren't just limited by the small storage, and once you had the game, you pretty much had the rest to do what you wanted with for the audio. And the music was a huge leap forward.
Yeah.
So here's some early examples that have some pretty great music. On the console side from 1989, we have a game called Ease, released by Falcom. And here we go. You'll notice that the graphics are still pretty basic, but the music sounds a bit different.
Yeah. It's that weird teenage era of game audio history where they couldn't quite figure out about the audio versus the graphics.
Now, you'll notice that other screenshot here on the right. So on the PC, Myst was one of the best-selling PC games for almost a decade, if you can believe that. It ushered in a new era of CD games that appealed to a wider audience, and the music played a big part in that. So we've certainly come a long way, haven't we? Now, what is all this building towards? Dynamic music in video games. Think back to that example of Space Invaders in 1978. Developers realized very early how powerful interactive music could be to the gaming experience. And by the 90s, we've reached a point where games can make some pretty cool sounds, and with some clever programming, we can do interesting things with interactivity to make the games even more engaging. So interactivity in dynamic music is really, really what gives games their power. It's not, now we're not just talking about the level of trying to imitate film. We have a totally new dimension we can play with.
So our final two examples here, we're going to play a bit of gameplay footage from two different games that demonstrate interactive music. In 1991, Monkey Island 2 was released by LucasArts, and it was the first game to use their iMuse system developed by Peter McConnell. It's a dynamic system that made transitions between music tracks more seamless.
So listen to this initial theme right here.
Yeah, we're in a shipyard. Listen to the groundwork and the instruments that's being used.
So pay attention to what happens when you walk into the building.
So we can see that the bottom of the track, the percussion kind of dropped off, and this new melody is layered on top. It's like this nice vertical alignment. A very seamless transition, very cool.
So we're back out to the city. Percussion comes back.
There's one more example here we want to show. It's doing a similar thing, but it's just so obvious in this game that it's fun to look at. Such a great soundtrack. Love that one. So in 1998, we have Banjo-Kazooie, which takes that real-time transition of audio to the next level in fully realized 3D. It's exactly what it sounds like underwater. But that seamless transition started making games a lot more enjoyable. It made it feel like you were driving the music and the audio.
So of course, we've seen a lot of development up to this point, and obviously a lot has changed since that time. It's been 20 years since that clip from 1998, 21 now, but the things that we've covered, these sort of pushing the boundaries, the idea of interactive audio, has really laid the foundations for what makes games what they are today, and will continue to inform games for many years to come. We still have retro games that kind of are influenced by old. We have this game Cuphead, which pulls very heavily from old animation traditions of the 1930s. It's a really cool game with an awesome big band soundtrack. We have great new games that are experimenting with art and color and interactivity in brand new ways, like Grease here. We were actually able to talk to the composers for both of these first two games. And of course, if you're a big gamer, we have things like Red Dead Redemption 2, which almost looks photorealistic. It's incredible.
Yeah, and surprisingly, it has amazing interactivity in music. You get this nice kind of homey Western soundtrack that changes as you start galloping faster and doing different things. So a lot of thought was put into the music interactive part.
So before we wrap up.
Before we wrap up, we wanted to mention some of the great upcoming events tonight and content this weekend. Yeah,
so we're going to be, you're going to be joining us actually in the next event, hopefully, for Austin Wintory performing a piece with Philippe Quint, Peter Dugan, the Triforce Quartet, and a new game by Rami Ismail in real time.
Yeah, there's also several more events tomorrow. The Library of Congress Arcade from 10 to 4, where you can play some of these games and experience them for yourselves. A talk on game preservation at 11 by the Library of Congress, where they're going to discuss the steps it takes to collect, catalog, and preserve video game content. And then finally, a talk by Winifred Phillips at 2 and her experiences on game composition.
So we want to thank everybody for joining us today, and actually, especially, we have a lot of people joining us from various places.
Yeah, so I want to say thanks. The community is huge for video game music, and it's growing, and the preservation is so awesome and important to us. And so a lot of our friends have joined in that do very similar things. We like to share and just have a good time. There's Rhythm and Pixels, Key Glyph, VG Embassy, all joining us. Craig over here. Greg Murray, and we're really happy that everybody's come out to hear some amazing game music and join us in the concert next door.
So thank you again for joining us. We've been Pixelated Audio. If you want to find us, you can look us up at pixelatedaudio.com, on Twitter, on Facebook, or contact us at that email address, contact@pixelatedaudio.com.
Yep. Thank you guys very much, and we'll see you at the concert.
Now we wanted to open things up just for a few minutes. Did anybody have any, like, one or two questions? Yeah, absolutely.
I only have one answer remaining. So choose wisely.
I've been a regular attendant at the Mag Fest last few years. So when they play the Game Boy chiptune thing, so all the composition of the songs they play in there is on the Game Boy console itself, or allow them to allow the musicians that are composing on a regular keyboard?
Well, most likely, there's actually a really popular program called LSDJ. That's one of the main ones. It's very similar to that tracker thing that we showed you. You have these like lanes where you say, play this at this time. That's one of the most common ones that Game Boy musicians use. There's a cartridge that some guy made that you can basically play it like a game and use it to write music directly onto the thing.
Yeah, we see it more and more as people become kind of nostalgic for these systems like the Game Boy, that they want to authentically recreate the sound, and so they come up with various ways to record from an actual Game Boy or an actual Sega Genesis or a PC 98 or a Nintendo, and be able to produce the sound that way rather than just playing through a keyboard.
You know, to follow along with that, one of the reasons why chiptune as a genre really came about is exactly the thing we've talked about. All of these systems are old now. They're cheap. You can buy them for almost nothing. They have great sound capabilities. So people are like, well, if you're just going to throw it away, I might as well use it to start making music. And that's really what it's been about. I mean, initially, it's grown so much. But yeah, I mean, chiptune has become sort of its own subculture of music where people use these very like retro-sounding sound chips to make new music today.
I wanted to ask something more modern, actually. Do you have any information about a more modern setting? If you have say an orchestra playing your music for your soundtrack, how would that technologically differ from using, say, a sample? Like, because you're probably not going to get through your whole track necessarily at any given moment. You're going to modulate it. How would that differ from just using, say, a sampler to create your music?
Well, we've actually talked to a few composers that had a lot of things to say about the same thing. I think it was Chris Madigan, who did Cuphead, actually, who mentioned that he wanted to sample some of the instruments, but he ended up turning to the live band to record most of it because he was able to get the best timbre out of that authentic, that real live band sound. Whereas the sample, you know, you could push it and make it do a lot of things, but it didn't quite get close to what his vision was. So I think it comes down to the composer and what they want.
Yeah, and with a sample, sometimes you're just limited. If you only have a few, they'll all sound kind of the same, whereas if you record an entire band, there'll be, you know, minor differences between the way that they're playing one passage versus another. So I think to answer your question, sometimes sampling is actually the better way, and people use sample libraries to play back this, you know, MIDI data or whatever and modulate in real time. Other times they'll just have full tracks. If this is just the band or this is just the guitarist playing, and then they will use these, sometimes it's called a stem, which is sort of sections, and they'll switch those stems out. It's a similar kind of process to what you're seeing, but with, you know, much bigger budgets, higher audio processing capabilities.
And I think also the imperfections that you get from live audio are very, very hard to replicate with samples. It's just too hard to recreate those minor mistakes and those minor nuances that you get from a live recording. Yeah. Anyone else? Good. All right, so I guess we're going over to the auditorium.
Yeah, it's about 7:20. I think we have a few minutes. I think they're planning on starting around 7:30, right? Or is 8? Okay, great.
Okay, great.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the talk.